rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Everyone, my name is Mazin Bamohrez. In this video, inshallah, I'll be talking about the history of Muslim China. Begin with a brief overview. We'll look at 4 different dynasties throughout the history of China, beginning with the Tang dynasty. During this time period, we'll look at how Islam was first introduced to the region. Then moving on to the Song dynasty, we'll look at how the early stages of Muslim settlement began taking place. And then we'll look at the Yuan dynasty. And in the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols actually invaded, they conquered China, and they became the ruling class in the Chinese government, right? And because of that, that allowed the Muslims to actually reach the upper echelons of the Chinese society, right? And then we'll look at the Ming dynasty. We'll look at the downfall of the Mongols and the rise of a new Han majority power. So inshallah, we'll begin by talking about the Tang dynasty. So during the Tang dynasty, right, the earliest written record of Islam's origin in China, it actually dates back all the way to the Khilafah of Uthman ibn Affan radiallahu anhu. Uthman actually sent a Sahabi by the name of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas as an ambassador to the Tang dynasty around 650, right? At that time, if you look at the map right here, after the establishment of Islam during the 1600s and the 1700s, during the Khulafa al-Rashidun and the Umayyad Caliphate, right? You can see that Islam stretched all the way from Spain to India, right? And the various cultures beyond the borders of the Islamic Empire, like East and West Africa, Central Asia, Islam slowly began to spread into those areas. And eventually those areas actually became the Muslim majority regions, right? Same thing happened in China, right? Islam slowly started spreading and entering China. However, the only difference is Islam or China, it never actually became a Muslim majority nation, right? It remained a minority religion in that region. Now, if we go back to the slide here, see this, the Islamic Empire at that time period geographically covered a very, very vast area, right? So that means it was a very prosperous time, or economically, it was a very good time for the Muslims, right? At the same time, all the way in China, the Far East, the Tang dynasty was also going through a similar prosperous time of peace and whatnot, right? So naturally, when you have two strong and prosperous, peaceful civilizations, right, they were bound to meet. They were bound to communicate with each other. And that is exactly what happened. A lot of Muslim merchants began coming into China from Central Asia, from Middle East, right? They started coming into China through the major trade routes like the Silk Road, and even through the sea, right, from southern Arabia all the way to the ports in southern China, right? So they started coming into China, and they started trading, right, and making business with the local population, right? And the Tang government at that time, they accepted them, they welcomed them, right? Because they benefited, both empires, the Islamic and the Chinese, they both benefited from this trade, right? By the year 651, there were already thousands of foreign merchants in the capital city of China, right? Most of them were Arab and Persian Muslims, right? So obviously, when these merchants, started trading in China, they brought with them Islamic teachings. They brought with them Islam. They brought with them the Quran, right? The emperor of the Tang dynasty, as I mentioned, he was very welcoming of these Muslim merchants, that he actually called them foreign guests, right? Next, inshallah, we'll look at the Song dynasty. And during the Song dynasty, right, the Chinese, they have their own long cultural heritage of their own. And to this day, the Chinese culture is very sophisticated by itself. Because of this, the Chinese people normally they don't integrate with foreign cultures. They're actually happy and satisfied with their own, because their culture itself is very strong and unique, right? It's very sophisticated. Religions such as Buddhism, Confucianism, Taoism, right? These Eastern religions were very different from Islam. Muslims in the Christian areas further west, right? They could relate with the Christians. The Christians could relate with the Muslims, right? Because of the shared history we have with them, about Ibrahim alayhi salam, about Musa and Isa alayhi salam, the Muslims in China could not relate with the native Chinese, right? So because of this, right, because of all of these reasons, culturally, religiously, they're almost polar opposites. The Muslims they tended to be separated from the mainstream Chinese society, right? They didn't really assimilate during the Song and dynasty, the Song and Tang dynasty. Muslims were isolated in communities away from the mainstream Chinese society, right? They were allowed to live there. They were allowed to trade and do their businesses. They were allowed to intermarry and whatnot, but they were not allowed to be fully assimilated into Chinese society. So by the time of the Song dynasty, Muslims, they played a major role in the Chinese economy. But despite all of this, they were still considered foreign guests. But that soon will change in the Yuan dynasty, right? The isolation that the Muslims faced, the isolated communities would end during the Mongol conquests of the 13th century, right? So the Mongols, the Genghis Khan rose into power, the Abbas Khilafah was destroyed, and eventually China also succumbed to the Mongols. And from this, the Yuan dynasty was formed. And they were ruled by the Mongols indirectly, right? So the Mongols, they were ruling China through the Yuan dynasty. So the Mongols, they had a vast empire, right? And it included Muslims from the Central Asia and Persia all the way to China, right? And because of the conquest that they waged, the wars that they waged in the Middle East and Central Asia, a lot of the cities and the regions over there were destroyed, right? A lot of Muslims, they lost their homes, their lands, right? And this resulted in a mass migration of Muslim refugees from those areas to China. China saw a huge boost in population of Muslims coming in from these areas, from the Middle East and Central Asia, right? So now, like I mentioned before, the Mongols, they were the ruling class, right, in China. And part of their strategy was to give these Muslims, the foreign immigrants, which were mainly Muslims, part of their strategy was to give them an elevated status over the Han Chinese, right? So before the Yuan dynasty, during the Song and the Tang, the Muslims were at a status below the Han Chinese indigenous people, right? But now they are at equal status or even higher than the Han Chinese, right? So now, because of this, the Mongols, they implemented an assimilated policy, right? So they actually forced and encouraged Muslims to actually move into China, to live in China, to assimilate with the Han Chinese, right? To enter into the mainstream Chinese culture. And as a result of this, right, start seeing a huge number of Muslim scholars, artisans, architects, astronomers, coming all the way from the Central Asia and from the Middle East. We started seeing them settling down in China. So now Muslim communities no longer served as an isolated enclave surrounded by non-Muslims, right? Now they were encouraged to take on more public roles in the society, especially the Mongol empires. They enlisted a lot of the Muslims in the military, as administrators in the government. They were encouraged to join bureaucratic structures of the Chinese government, right? So next, inshallah, we'll talk about the Ming dynasty. The Ming dynasty, right? So throughout the late Yuan dynasty and the early Ming dynasty, right? The Chinese Muslims, they fully assimilated with the Chinese culture, right? And during the early Ming dynasty, there were actually a few dozens of provincial level governors that were actually Muslims. And obviously, when you have leaders and influential people in the government that are representing Muslims, then the status of Islam becomes elevated, right? And that's exactly what we see. The Islam became a recognized religion. The Ming dynasty, also the founders of the Ming dynasty, it was said that 6 of their most trusted generals were Muslim, right? So we can see that they were no longer seen as foreigners, but rather as Chinese countrymen with their own identity, the Hui. Now the Hui and the Hans, right? The Hui, they were no different from the Hans. The Hui ethnically were the same as the Hans, but religiously they were different. Huis, religiously they were Muslim, right? Religiously they were Muslim. The Hans, religiously they were non-Muslim, right? So the only difference was their religion. ethnically they were the same. So the Hueys, you could, if you look at a person that is a Huey, you see that he's a fully Chinese person, yet he's Muslim. And it was during this time that perhaps the most famous Chinese Muslim, and to this day, the people of China, they remember him as a great naval explorer. His name was He. He was one of China's greatest explorers, right? He was a Hui identity, and he was from the Yunnan region in the south. He was favored by the Ming government to actually expand. He was given command of a large fleet of ships, and he was given the responsibility of trading with distant lands and establishing diplomatic relations between them, right? And his voyages included, dozens of modern-day countries throughout Asia, Middle East. But he was most remembered for his time in spreading Islam in the Malay archipelago, right? So Indonesia, Philippines, those areas, actually Islam came to those areas because of this person. So now the late Ming dynasty comes in, and you see a new regime established by the majority Han Chinese. The Mongols are gone. They're taken over by this new regime, which is mostly consists of Han Chinese, and they're not really tolerant of foreign ideas and philosophies of the previous dynasty, right? So they started restricting Islamic ideas and promoting local thoughts and ideologies. They started promoting Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and started restricting Islam, Christianity, and other foreign religions, right? So this regime, along with the Han assimilation, because as I said, the Hueys, they're fully integrated with the Chinese, they started adopting their culture. They slowly started to forget about their Islamic identity, right? There was a crisis of knowledge because of after the invasion of the Mongols. A lot of the Islamic libraries and the Islamic knowledge sources were destroyed, right? Circled back to being a foreign religion, right? So throughout time, eventually Islam started losing its power, its effectiveness in the region. Islam became back to being a foreign and exotic religion. That's all. Jazakumullah khair for tuning in. Hope you guys learned something. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.